Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. There's been a growing wave of Islamophobic, racist, and anti-migrant incidents across the Western world. Right-wing outrage over Toblerone chocolates being halal certified. A 14-year-old veiled Syrian refugee beaten up in a Pittsburgh school washroom. Salvini's anti-migrant law in Italy, and the resignation of the Belgian Prime Minister over a non-binding migration pact. Well, now to discuss all of this a bit further, we're joined now by Mr. Reza Rumi, who is a journalist, and he is joining us live right here in our studios in Lahore. Reza, thanks for joining us. We're also joined on the line by Shamil Shams, who is a journalist with DW English, and he's joining us on the line from Bonn in Germany. And we're also joined by Ms. Shakufa Tahiri, who is the policy officer at Refugee Council of Australia, and she is joining us live now from Sydney via Skype. Thank you both for joining us as well. Reza, I'll start with you if I may. I know that there have been a number of incidents that we can cite, especially in the UK. We've had those Syrian refugees, the young ones in the schools, they're beaten up as well. We've had this recent incident in Pittsburgh as well, and now this Toblerone chocolate outrage as well. Some of it sounds a bit silly, but it's a sign of the times, isn't it, about the feeling of hatred?
It is indeed a very worrying sign of the times, because what is happening is that Islamophobia, racism, as you rightly said, is actually a symptomatic of the growing xenophobic sentiment across Europe, to some degree in the US. And the reality is that that globally we are now passing through a very dangerous phase of a fascist wave across the world. So if you look at what is happening in Hungary, if you look at the rise of far-right parties in Germany, if you look at the election of Trump and his ideology in America, and it is not just the Western world. I'd like to add, look at what is happening in Brazil. Brazil has elected a prime minister who is also a very neo-fascist in his outlook and overtones, and so it's like a global epidemic. And in that, the states are getting more and more nationalistic, inward-looking, xenophobic. While we had thought that globalization would actually turn into a better global understanding, global integration, so somewhere this globalization project has gone wrong. Right. And so I'm setting out this context because we have to understand Islamophobia within that context. And that is why, unfortunately, after the brutal incidents of 9/11, a new kind of imagination of Islam and Muslims came into being. And there, the Muslim figure or the Muslim persona was painted as a violent, right, as a medieval, brutal being, and somehow it had to be countered because, West was fighting communism for so long. The communist countries sort of gave up communism, Berlin Wall fell, and now they needed a new enemy. Yeah. And the new enemy came in the form of Al-Qaeda, and 9/11 spurred that. But unfortunately, that has been terrible for Muslim communities living abroad, right, particularly in Europe and the US, where you have increased hatred, increased fear, increased surveillance, and actually denial of fundamental rights that the Western civilization touts. Yeah, and preaches to other countries.
So let's bring in somebody from Europe then. Shamil, I wanted to get your thoughts, not just of course on this Toblerone issue, because I know the AfD in Germany has spoken out about that, saying that just by calling this chocolate halal, that shows the Islamization of Europe. But in general terms, can you just put into context for us what your thoughts are about Islamophobia, not just where you are in Germany, but across Europe?
Well, I think we tend to generalize a little bit. Okay. I agree that there is Islamophobia. It has risen over the years. The AfD, Alternative for Germany, this party has made it to the German parliament. It's extraordinary. The situation is extraordinary. There is Islamophobia, but these groups, these right-wing groups, are not just against Islam. They are also against other minorities. They are against the black people, anybody who's different. We tend to emphasize too much on Islam because this is the narrative which unfortunately sells all over the world. So what I want to emphasize is that there are all sorts of xenophobic tendencies emerging in Europe. And it's not just Islam. At the same time, we see that a large number of people in Europe, on the one hand, we just focus on people who are against the Muslims, but there are hundreds and thousands of people. They come out in large numbers when there are rallies in support of Muslims, in support of the Syrian refugees, in support of the people coming from North Africa to Germany, in support of Chancellor Angela Merkel's policies vis-a-vis the refugees. So these tendencies also exist. There are liberal voices here as well, in the U.S. where Raza Bhai comes from. So there are all sorts of tendencies, and we see there's a growing conflict all over the world. In Pakistan, for example, populism has risen. You have a populist Prime Minister, Imran Khan, now. And he caters to a lot of right-wing people. So it is not just in Europe. We see, as Mr. Rumi said, that it is happening all over the world. But there are counter-narratives, there are counter-voices, and they are also making their presence felt.
Very well. Let me put that point. I'm glad you made that point there, Shamil, because Shikufa, I wanted to get your thoughts on that. I know you work obviously closely with refugees of all sorts there in Australia. So tell us about your thoughts when it comes to Islamophobia in the context not just of Australia, but what you've, of course, observed in the Western world.
Well, I actually agree with my colleagues who talked previously. I think that it is part of a larger picture. It has, changed with the tides and the turns of the international politics and the international, leadership that has been displayed. And we see that, across the world in the US, the type of leadership that has been portrayed, and that actually does have a kind of, international effect. Even though Australia is pretty secluded from the rest of the world, Australia does actually feel the effect of leadership at that stage. And in terms of Australia, yes, Islamophobia has surged in a very great proportion. We see that, unfortunately, refugees become, at the receiving end of these Islamophobic attacks and Islamophobic sentiments. It is unfortunate because refugees who are fleeing terror are actually facing another type of terror in a place that is supposedly a safe place for them, but it is not. It is the truth of the kind of leadership that's being spewed. It's really the resultant consequences of the international politics. And so I do agree that it is actually not just confined in a it's not geographically distinct. It is actually a worldwide phenomenon. In terms of Australian context, there have been different waves of xenophobia. Firstly, when the migrant groups actually came in the 1950s, they were heavily discriminated by the majority of the population in Australia. And then came the Vietnamese, the Indo-Chinese refugees. They were discriminated in the same way. And then came the Muslims at the wake of 2001. And they were actually shown the same kind of hostility and sentiments. So I think that it becomes, in a way, very cyclical. In Australia, it does tend to, Islamophobic attacks tend to rise when it's closer to the election times. And we have recently actually seen a surge of attacks on the South Sudanese community. So a community that is emerging, and it's from South Sudan, and a very new community in Australia. And they are seen as in this very binary light, and as a foreign, as alien group that Australian population are not familiar with. So it does seem that political leadership.
I'm glad you mentioned that point, Shikuva, because I'm going to interrupt you on that point. I'm going to put that point to Raza. Raza, Shikuva, there's just the fact that whenever we have elections close by in the West, be it Australia, be it the UK, be it the United States, as we had with the Trump campaign as well, it seems that we have more right-wing sentiments, ever more, brutal, if that's the right term, in nature coming up every time that happens. Do you think a lot of this does have to do with politics more than anything else? When we see, like I said, the brutal attack on that girl in Pittsburgh, that's quite a disturbing video to watch.
No, absolutely. I think there is a very clear, you see, we have to understand all of this is political. Islamophobia or whether these assertion of national identities or regional or local identities, it's a political response to something that's going on. Okay. So why has Trump risen in America, who says he'll build a wall, he's blocking Mexican migrants or migrants from Central America? They're not Muslims, right? Yeah. So the thing is that this is a political act to pacify your home constituency, saying we will not take these new guys, take away your jobs, right? So I think at the heart of the matter is that the world in the last 30 years has undergone massive rounds of inequality. Mm-hmm. So today we live in a world which has never been as unequal as before. So I'll give you a figure that, you know, the top 10% population of the world control more than 80% of wealth. In fact, even less than top 10%. Right. And in certain countries, this inequality is very, very acute. And it's not just the US or Europe. I mean, look at India, where you have huge inequality growing, large swathes of poverty, and you have rise of Modi, who says, you know, the external enemy or the Muslims are the enemy. So it's a very political process. But having said that, I'll come to your point that about the populist politics is that the populist politics always otherizes certain persons, certain groups, certain communities, certain individuals, and they paint them as the enemies of the jobs, of prosperity and happiness, and their task is how to demonize them, how to undermine them, how to block them physically through a wall or through laws, through regulations or through maltreatment. So, you know, but as Shamil rightly said, that we must not also paint a monolithic picture, because within these societies, whether they're in the West or elsewhere, there's also pushback. So in the United States, for example, where I have been living for the last more than 4.5 years, 5 years almost, there's a lot of resistance against this whole thing. I mean, I myself am I'm there on a work visa, but I'm a kind of a migrant. So you see, I have also been accepted in by the community where I live in, but I know that there are other communities which would not accept me, which would brand me either for being my brown skin or my Muslim name or my Muslim identity. So it's a very mixed bag. So what is happening is that there's this tension going on, the tension between the older values of enlightenment, of inclusion, of equality, versus the new kind of fascist politics. And I think the next decade or so is going to be a tense time for the world. You know, we have seen a little snippet of it here in Pakistan as well, you know, in the form of the entire sort of public opinion against the Afghan refugees. I mean, we had hosted millions for years. Suddenly, after a few years, a few years ago, we realized, oh my God, they are a threat, or they are aiding the terrorists, etc. And then public opinion turned against them. They, you know, we all said, oh, well, they must go back home now.
Let me pick up on the point of public opinion, because I think that's an important point, and I know that Shakufa brought that up as well earlier as well. And I wanted to put that to you, Shamil, because it does seem, Shamil, that politics is in play here, and it's important for populist politicians specifically to pick up on these sorts of sentiments and run with them for their own political careers. Do you think that is what's happening in Europe, for example, or even in Germany with the AfD? And secondly, do you think that there is also then this feeling of the fact that there is now economic inequality growing as well, that there is this feeling, however incorrect or correct it may be, that migrants take jobs away from citizens?
Well, I agree with you, and I think that capitalism is in a big crisis all over the world. It has failed to deliver. There has not been any equality all over the world. So what we see is, and on top of that, there are wars. So what happened in the Middle East in the past few years, it has been completely destabilized. And there has been an influx of refugees coming from Libya, North Africa, to Italy and Spain. And so you see that this has been happening. And people, obviously, when people from these countries come to Europe, they land in Spain and Italy, and then they move to Germany and Central Europe. The people here, the working class people here, feel threatened that they would take away their jobs, that these people would change the culture of their countries, their lifestyle. And there has been attacks. There was in there has been attacks at Christmas markets here, for example, in Berlin. People have been scared. So you have to understand that the politicians, obviously the right-wing populist parties, to kind of to cash in these kind of situations, and they have gained popularity over the years. But obviously, Chancellor Merkel, for example, in Germany, has been steadfast in her approach that we would welcome the refugees, although not many are coming in anymore. Yeah. But these kind of political situations, economic situations are in play here, and obviously the populist groups are going to benefit from these threats. If someone attacks the Christmas market in Germany, obviously the right-wing groups would say, okay, these people are coming from these Islamic countries, as if Islam or Islamic countries, it's a monolith. It is not. But obviously they just paint like everything in a homogeneous manner. So they have been cashing in on this situation. The important thing is that there are also groups who are, as I said earlier, trying to counter this narrative.
Indeed, and I wanted to pick up on that point.
But the problem is that capitalism continues to create inequalities. Yeah. Okay. And until we really talk about, because we have stopped discussing it, it has become out of fashion over the years to explain things in a Marxist manner, in a socialist way, to analyze economy. All we talk about, we discuss symptoms. We never kind of talk about what is causing these conflicts. All political conflicts are economic conflicts, and until we discuss capitalism, the problems within capitalism properly, I don't think we can have Islamophobia. All these things are just they are just manifestations of this larger disease, I would say.
Shikufa, do you agree with that? Do you think that a lot of this has to do with the economy and the fact that we are going through worldwide, really, economic inequality, A, and B, just economic pressures upon citizens?
I think that is probably true, and I think that the politicians actually play with that. That is a very, that becomes then a strategy for politicians to actually make that worse than it actually is. So I think with politics of fear comes elements like actual fear about economic situation of a person, fear about the safety situation of a person. So I think that aspects of fear, that is economical fear, and I think that is part also to the larger narrative behind xenophobia and xenophobic sentiments.
Raza, let's move on if we can, because I think that, as you mentioned, and as Shamil has mentioned, there are groups both in the US, both in Germany, and across Europe, across the world really, that are working to counter Islamophobia, working to counter this sort of hatred. How effective do you think that has been? Because in an era of Trump, one can really question the efficacy of any such moves at this point.
I think they have been rather effective, if I were to say, far more than we see in our countries. I mean, for example, the US elections were completed in November. Yeah. And for the first time in the history of the United States, we have 2 Muslim women in the Congress. One of them is a Palestinian American who is very pro-Palestine, who's very clear about that. She's not an apologist. She doesn't praise Israel just because she has to get the support of a certain lobby. And then the other one is also a very proud Somali Muslim. Of course, she was elected from an area where you have a concentration of Somali Americans. But the reality is that they are there. And they are traditional, they are not shy of their identity, unlike a lot of other characters we see in Europe and in the US who shun Islam or say, we are no longer Muslims or blah, blah, just to get fit in and integrate. Yeah. These are women who are very clear about their identity. Then if you remember in Hillary Clinton's campaign, a Pakistani American guy whose son died in Iraq, he, the entire Democratic Party owned that person, that family, etc. So there has been pushback. I think it's, but it's definitely kind of weak in front of the tide of xenophobia, in front of the tide of capitalist crisis. Because all of this is, we have to understand that, politics is driven by economic factors. And the economic anxieties, inequalities, loss of jobs, the incoming recession. Now all the world economists are warning that, there will be just another meltdown maybe next year, or the world is moving towards that. So that anxiety and that fear is what drives this hatred. So we have to contextualize that. But I think partly I think it's also a time for the Muslims to reflect on why the world chooses to see them. Why are the Muslims with such rich countries, the oil-rich states, which diverse history? I mean, Muslims are the one who contributed to mathematics, to science, to biology, to medicine. The Spanish era was a golden era of Islam, of Muslim history. It wasn't that far away when Europe was in dark ages. What happened? We also have to reflect. Something has gone wrong where we have stopped teaching science and technology to our students. All these oil-rich kingdoms, look at how much they invest in science, for example. How much do we emphasize on innovation? And the rise of this whole culture, this narrative, jihadist narrative, and the seminaries that are sponsored by the Middle East as well, unfortunately, we have to also stop that. In Pakistan, we are taking the lead. Our state since 2014 has very actively fought these groups. Our National Action Plan is very clear about hate speech. We have leaders committed to reducing bigotry in the country, both army and civilian. So I think other Muslim countries also need to take the lead. Countries in particularly the Middle East, where they are also facing this blowback by the extremist view. And extremism, Islam is a religion of moderation. There is no room for extremist thought. If there was room for extremist thought, Islam would not have grown, and it's still growing. In the United States, it's a growing religion. In Europe, it's growing.
And I wanted to, with that very good point, Islam is a religion of moderation. Reza, I wanted to just announce a very quick break. Viewers, we'll be back after this very short break, continue our discussion, and now we want to get specifically into, as Reza there mentioned, what is the Muslim world's role, the Muslim community's role in all of this as well, and we're going to add another voice to this conversation. Please stay tuned with us. Viewers, thank you very much for joining us as we continue to discuss Islamophobia and now connecting it with the issue of migrants around the world. I'm going to add another voice to this conversation. We're joined now, of course, by Reza Rumi, as I said, who's still with us here in the studios in Lahore, and we're also now joined by Dr. Maureen Sire, who is the Director of Interfaith Scotland. Maureen, thanks for joining us here in The Scope. Maureen, I know that in the UK there right now is a bit of a debate about something as simple as a definition of Islamophobia, and there's a controversy over that, there's debate over that, with even Trevor Phillips, the former chairman of the Equality and Human Rights Commission, saying it would be a grave mistake, in fact, to define Islamophobia as a form of racism. What do you make not just of that debate specifically over how we define Islamophobia, but just of this entire macro issue really of growing hatred?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think it's absolutely tragic that there's growing hatred towards people from any faith tradition, including Islam. There is a rise, as you say, in Islamophobia, there's a rise in anti-Semitism, and there's a rise in kind of religious intolerance, really, right across Europe, which is tragic, actually, given how much religious communities do for the common good, particularly here in Scotland, but I'm sure elsewhere in the world as well. So I think it's in a broader picture of a sort of anti-religious sentiment. Now, sadly, my own perception is that the media is very quick to report on anything at all that's negative in relationship to religion, and that includes, of course, profiling the sort of negative news about Islam, and it feeds fear, and that fear then causes hate crimes, really, causes people to lash out. So there's a huge amount of education, engagement, interfaith dialogue, all sorts of work really needs to be done to try to create the society and the environment where people are welcomed, whatever their background, whatever their religion, whatever their, their cultural identity, that all of that is really just seen as part and parcel of this incredible multi-religious, multi-faith, multicultural world that we live in. But we can't deny that there is definitely a rise in hate crime, and that's pretty tragic.
All right, so Reza, Maureen there just mentioned two very good points, and I want to pick up on her point about education and engagement. Basically, it seems that a lot of this hatred, and this is something that you can tell me if I'm wrong about, but they say that fear rises essentially out of ignorance. And that it's been proven in the past that if there is more interaction with Muslim communities and non-Muslim communities, or even any other community really, any other minorities in any country, that there would be more understanding, there would be more tolerance for each other. Do you think that Muslims have played a role, though, in a bit of that through what many would call their ghettoization in many places in the West, where they just try to, or that's what the argument is, that they live only amongst themselves, engage only amongst themselves? Is there a valid point there, do you think?
I think this accusation of ghettoization is also a racist tool. Okay. Because all communities, wherever they exist, whether they are Vietnamese, Muslims, Filipinos, they live in their communities. People want to speak their language, eat their food, meet each other. It's a natural human urge. That's how communities are formed. I think the real important problem here is the ghettoization of the mind, of the thought. As Allama Iqbal wrote, in 1930s in his lectures, he said that how the Muslims had stopped thinking, had stopped evolving. The principle of movement in Islam is one of his 10 lectures, lecture number 6, talks about that. So I think the Muslim world and the Muslim intelligentsia and the Muslim thinkers have to do that within Muslim countries. Outside, it is already happening. Progressive Muslims are reinterpreting the faith. They are correcting the mistakes that have come through the rise of mullahs. But in Muslim majority countries like Indonesia, Pakistan, Malaysia, India has a big Muslim population. There you have this thing. No, we cannot say anything about it. It is a task of clerics or the mullahs to do it. While Islam does not even have the institution of clergy. The Christianity created an institution of clergy. Nowhere in the Holy Quran or in the Hadith or even in tradition there is a concept of an intermediary. So we have to challenge that as well. We have to challenge that, and we have to think of the enlightenment within Islam. Nur or light is central to the idea of Holy Quran, of Prophet's teachings. I mean, the Prophet, peace be upon him, is a epitome of Nur for us, light. So what is that light? The light of knowledge, of enlightenment. So education is absolutely a very important part where the communities have to engage with each other, but Muslims also have to incorporate some of that education. These whole, worn out notions that Muslims are superior to non-Muslims or the Muslims will go to heaven. I mean, that's what a lot of kids are taught in Muslim communities. That has to change.
So if I may just come in here, Reza, in your experience in the United States, so what have interactions between Muslims and non-Muslims been like? What's your interaction, for example, been like with people of any faith and other faiths?
No, it has been very complicated because when you are faced with people get their information from mainstream media, the mainstream corporate media in the West is completely biased. Not only biased, but it is also very much linked to the national security imperatives of whether it's the US or Europe. So if they're fighting a war on terror, they have to demonize Muslims. That's why, when you have a white man shooting hundreds of people in a cinema or a mall or a concert, he's mentally ill, he's sick, he's depressed, he's lonely. But you have a Muslim guy going and doing something far less damaging, terrorism, So this whole media framing has to be blamed. So the ordinary person knows that. So when he or she talks to you about Islam, about Muslims, their ideas come from New York Times, from CNN, from these hates websites, Wikipedia pages that are unchecked, that spew hatred. So I think that is where it is very important to focus on the correct representations, on giving a pushback to these narratives. And that is what I have been doing in my engagement in various forums, in the universities I teach. in my classroom and outside classroom, in the community, in activism. So I try and tell people that, first of all, Muslims are not a monolith. They're 1.2, 1.5 billion people of different color, languages, faiths, sects. I mean, there's no one Muslim. And you and I will, if we start talking about something, we'll some point disagree or diverge.
I'm going to cut you off, Reza, just before going on break, I wanted to get in Maureen back in here, if I may. Maureen, one of the things that I mentioned to Reza as well, Maureen, is this issue of ghettoization, as many people speak about. And Reza made that good point about ghettoization of the mind. Do you think that plays a role here, A? And B, what do you make of the media's role in all of this as well?
Yes, I do think there's a ghettoization of the mind, and I do actually agree that people do tend to. I mean, like seekers like. It's natural for, say, for example, in Scotland here, the Muslim community, the majority in Glasgow, might live in the south side of Glasgow, but that's where the central mosque is, and it's just a natural thing for them to be there. But they will also very readily mix with people from other faith traditions. So I want to give a really good example, actually. The recent Pittsburgh synagogue shooting, which was really tragic. Within not even 24 hours of that shooting, I had a phone call from the Muslim Council of Scotland saying, Maureen, we want to go to the synagogue. We want to go to the synagogue and we want to say to the rabbi, we're so sorry that this has happened to his community. And so we organised that. The Muslim Council of Scotland were met outside the synagogue, brought in, welcomed by the rabbi, and stood in solidarity. So there's that. I mean, that's an example of the Muslim community really reaching out to other faith communities. And likewise, when there was attack on the Sikh Gurdwara here, the faith community supported the Sikh community with that arson attack. And I know that the communities of Scotland do exactly the same when there's things done, when there's Islamophobic attacks on the Muslims. That we have to see an attack on one is an attack on all, and that together we have to really work very hard to create the kind of world where hopefully there'll never be these kind of attacks. We'll see each other as friends from all the different faith traditions. And it's very difficult. We look at it's easy sometimes to point outside of our own country and say, there's a problem here, there's a problem there. Yeah. I mean, I know all of you will be very aware of the just how sometimes the blasphemy laws in Pakistan can be used to castigate minorities. So it's all societies. It's not just America, it's not just Europe, it's also Pakistan. It's all societies have to really work very hard to see, are we genuinely welcoming to the other? Are we genuinely able to say, as the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said, that there should be no pressure in religion, and that people have to have freedom of conscience. Interfaith Scotland operates the cross-party group on freedom of religion and belief in the Scottish Parliament, and we bring people from all sorts of countries and all sorts of areas of the world where they're receiving religious persecution. So, for example, we had the director of the Burma campaign come and talk to us about the terrible treatment of the Rohingya Muslims in Burma. So we look at all situations and say it shouldn't be happening to anyone.
Okay, so Maureen, I'm glad you mentioned the issue of Rohingyas. I apologize for coming in, but I wanted to keep that as our final point before we go into this break. I will thank, of course, Reza for coming into the studio and for speaking to us on this issue of Islamophobia. And earlier, of course, we had Shakufa as well. Maureen, do stay with us. After this break, viewers, we will switch just a tad bit onto the issue of migrants specifically. This is, of course, related to this issue of Islamophobia. We're going to look at that macro issue of migrants as well. Do stay tuned for that as well. Viewers, welcome back. Now, in the first segment of this show, we spoke about Islamophobia and all related issues. And now we can use that as an excuse to also go on to and talk about the issue of migrants and the entire issue, the refugee crisis, etc., as well as migrant laws around the world. We still have with us Dr. Maureen Sire, who is the director of Interfaith Scotland. And we're now joined by Mr. Peter Kleppe, who is the head of the Brussels office of Open Europe. Peter, thank you for joining us here in the scope. Now, Peter, we can cite many examples, can't we? For example, the Salvini law in Italy, and now we can also talk about the fact that the Belgian Prime Minister has resigned after signing this UN migration pact because of pressure that was put on him by his coalition partner. What do you make of that entire issue, Peter?
Well, I think it shows, the Belgian case shows that uncontrolled migration really is a massive issue in Western Europe and in the West in general. I think when a largely non-binding UN pact can make a government coalition collapse. Now, the party that basically drove this coalition to collapse is the most popular party in the country, the NVA. They are not against migration, but they are in favor of controlling migration. And even if they admit that the migration pact is largely non-binding, they think that it really solidifies and continues the status quo. So they want drastic changes to migration policies. They are, for example, in favor of disembarkation platforms, something that has been decided by EU leaders back in June, but that has not been into practice. It means that people entering Europe in an irregular manner would be asked to wait in a safe place, so to apply for asylum. And this is quite important because it would mean that people would no longer have an incentive to risk their lives. And at least 15,000 people have been dying in recent years in the Mediterranean Sea. So I think you can make a good case that the status quo in terms of migration policy isn't actually very successful. So the argument, at least from that party, is, look, this is business as usual. This pact was approved, by the way, yesterday by the United Nations in New York.
Yeah.
So they say we need drastic changes, and they asked that the Prime Minister was going to abstain in New York. So they were not asking him to vote against, but only to abstain. But even that was too much. The political background in Belgium is that the Prime Minister is seen in a part of the country, the Francophone part, as somebody who's always giving in to that NVA party, the center-right nationalist party. And therefore, he was not very keen to give in now, and as a result of that, the government.
Okay, so Peter, let me pick up on that point you just made there, because I think that there are some parallels possibly with the situation in Belgium with the UK. Maureen, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it does seem like obviously when the Brexit vote happened, for example, in the UK, there was a lot of concern, and there still is a lot of concern about migration and migrants and how the UK will deal with that, be they EU migrants or other migrants. Maureen, what are your thoughts on that?
Yes, I think, pre, post, and whatever's going to happen with Brexit, of course, that whole discussion around Brexit, for example, really a lot of that was fueled by discussion around migration and, the asylum seekers, refugees, whether, we should allow, not allow, all of that was very much part and parcel, and sadly did fuel some pretty sad expressions of fear towards the other. However, in Scotland, I don't know if you know, there's a discussion paper and evidence and policy and powers for the Scottish Parliament in relation to migration, and just in number 74 of that paper, it says that that really what Scotland wants to be, it touches on benefits to society of being an open, welcoming, multicultural European nation, and including exploring the particular benefits that migrants bring to sustaining our rural communities. So in Scotland, we really do want and welcome migrants to Scotland, but it's a devolved issue. It's a reserved issue, so it's not something that Scotland has particular control over. But I do know that there are so many programs in Scotland to try to welcome the migrant, welcome the asylum seeker, welcome the refugee, and make them feel that Scotland could potentially be a place where they would want to have as their home. But it's complex because Scotland's only a tiny little country in a great big European conglomerate, and there's so many. I mean, every situation will be different. Every nation will be different. The policies of all the different governments will be different. So it's a very complex matter.
Indeed. If I may, Maureen, I wanted to come in here because I want to put a point to you, Peter, about this pact as well, because the Canadian Prime Minister, for example, has spoken about the fact that in his country too there has been criticism of him signing on to this pact, this UN Migration Pact specifically is what I'm talking about. And in the pact itself, it does say, as you pointed out correctly, this is not binding. But secondly, it reaffirms the sovereign rights of states, and I'm reading off a specific quote, of states to determine their national migration policy, and asserts the fundamental importance of legal migration. So they're saying that within international law, each state can still decide how it will choose to approach their national migration policy. Do you think that that has been something that's been overlooked by many of those people, creating a bit of fervor over this issue, Peter?
Well, there's so much in the pact. You can really find what you want in it. Okay. But I think that's a little bit the problem. It basically says that the current policies are fine. There are some elements in the pact that could sort of point to a solution. For example, that countries would be obliged to take back their nationals, which is an obligation anyway that they have. There are some elements in the other direction whereby it is stated that family reunification should become more easily. And that's, of course, a tough one because obviously when people are married, it's obvious that that should be possible. But what do you do with parents? Should parents be able to reunify with their kids when their kids migrate abroad? Should grandparents be able to? I mean, in some agreements that my country, Belgium, has concluded in the past, particularly with Turkey, it was foreseen that even grandparents could come over. So I think those arrangements are typically things that make integration in societies more complex. So there's things in both directions in the pact, but there is no clear direction. I think that's the main problem with it. Now you can say, well, if it doesn't do much harm, why not sign it? Sure, that's one valid argument. But you could say, look, it's time to give a signal that this is a serious issue and we really can't continue with business as usual. Many people have died at sea. Also, there's a system whereby if you use smugglers, you can somehow get into safe countries. If you're weak or you don't have any money, then tough luck. Then you have to stay where you are. I mean, so there's so many unfair situations. I think, first of all, what we have to do is to create a safe place where people can apply for asylum, so they do not have an incentive to enter in irregular manner, and thereby help smuggling mafia that is making enormous fortunes at this moment, actually. And then secondly, much more ambitious, is, I think, to create what I call refugee cities, for people that have been denied entry, because even the greatest proponents of open migration, they typically never have an answer for people that are denied asylum, what they call economic migrants. Now, I think being an economic migrant is not something that is bad. I think it's perfect. It's perfectly fine to try to leave your country. I think if you think that you're going to be better off somewhere else. And if that is not possible, I really think that we should try to make it possible. But then, of course, there's something like the absorption capacity of industrialized countries. So why should they not try to replicate their own societies somewhere else? And this may sound a little unrealistic, and I think politically it is at the moment, but practically there's actually a few precedents. I'm thinking in particular of Hong Kong, which was a piece of Britain, so to speak, in terms of rule of law, outside of the United Kingdom. It really was a hub for refugees from communist China. So if the British could pull off something like that back in the 50s, giving the prospects for a better life to millions of Chinese, why should the combined industrialized countries of today not be able to replicate something like that?
Peter. Okay, Peter. So I'm gonna come in here, Peter, just because we have run out of time. But that was a fascinating point to end on, and I wish we could have continued that discussion. We will try to at a later date with both of you as well and other guests. But we of course appreciate Peter Kleppe, who is the head of the Brussels office in Europe, for his insight, and of course we appreciate Dr. Maureen Sire, Director of Interfaith Scotland, for sharing her thoughts with us as well and for her time. So viewers, we've been talking from the beginning of this show. We started off with talking about Islamophobia. We use the example, of course, of the outrage over Toblerone declaring that it's halal certified. Always has been, really, because the recipe has not changed ever since Toblerone's been manufactured and created. We also spoke about that incident in Pittsburgh with that young Muslim Syrian girl who was attacked in a school washroom, apparently in a hate crime. However, the accused will not be charged with a hate crime at this time. And then we moved on to the issue of migrants. And all of this, of course, is related because it shows the trend in the world right now. That is one of populism and of keeping the other as the other and fear of the other. We'll keep a very close eye, of course, on all of these stories that we've spoken about here, and of course any further developments for later shows here on Scope. But thanks for watching for this edition. I've been Waqar Rizvi.